Last April, I stood in a Las Vegas conference room facing the top 20 leaders of an organization, and they wanted to hear from me two things. They wanted to know first, how they were going to get their people back in the office more frequently, and two, how to do that as quickly as possible. Now, I knew from previous conversations with these leaders that their motivation was not a lack of trust, and it wasn't a lack of respect for the job everyone had been doing 3 years working mostly remotely. They were motivated by a deep concern that certain aspects of quality, talent development, and culture were not happening as effectively and consistently as they needed to ensure long-term performance. Now, one leader even said to me, listen, this is not some big power trip on my part. This is me genuinely wanting these professionals to develop as best as they can, and I'm concerned it's not happening the way we're doing it now. The problem was that their default context for how to resolve these performance issues was for everybody to come back to the office. Now, they also thought it would be super simple and fast if we just mandated a certain number of days for people to come back to the office, like 3. Or maybe we do 50% of their time on site, like many of the other people in their industry had been doing. Now, the problem is I knew that this was going to immediately smash into a very different employee context for where performance and work were happening, since COVID took a wrecking ball to the traditional place-based work model 3 years earlier. You see, employees see things much more flexibly now, and they see the office as a place to work, but not necessarily the place to work. So what we were seeing was that employees, they not only were seeing that they could work differently, but they thought that they could work really, really well, as we found from a survey that we conducted last summer of a nationally representative sample of full-time US workers. These workers told us that they had 97% said they had some degree of work-life flexibility already.
42% said they had more flexibility than they had before the pandemic.
And here's where they think they're doing a good job. 75% said they are as or more productive and engaged, and 92% felt their ability to communicate, create, and innovate either increased or stayed the same. And 88% were pretty satisfied with what they were doing in terms of flexibility. The second issue was mandates don't change mindsets. And we knew that if these leaders went forward with this issue, they were going to risk that they were going to fall into the same spiral of employee-employer antagonism that we see playing out in the headlines practically every day. And it begins like this. A workplace invites their employees back to the office voluntarily. Now, remember, employees think they're already doing the performance that is the rationale for coming back. So what happens is employees naturally ask, why? Why am I coming back? And then when they don't begin to show up as much as the leaders would like them to, well, then the leaders, they double down and they say, okay, we're going to mandate that you come back a certain number of days. And then when employees still don't show up, they double down again and they start to track your badge swipes. And then what employees do is they start to take valuable work time to figure out how to game the system, which then causes employers to double down again. And they say, well, you know what? Then your return to office compliance is going to be part of your compensation and performance evaluation, which then only causes employees to further disengage, if not quit. So I was getting ready to present to these leaders a team-based process that would not only avoid this clash, but engage the entire workforce in the process of reimagining where, when, and how work was done. and create the parameters of a new flexible work model that the organization and the individuals would agree to work within. This flexible work model would not only support the flexibility that employees really valued, but it would put in place some of the operational coordination and performance objective focus on things like quality and culture that in many cases is often missing right now. And as a result, it would benefit both the individual employee and the organization. The problem was that this takes time, it takes patience with experimentation, and it takes resources. Three things that I was pretty sure in that moment, these 20 leaders were not interested in supporting at all. Now, I was lucky. I knew the chief people officer who hired us also agreed that a return to office mandate was not the way to go. She not only thought it would alienate the workforce, but it would make it hard to recruit. And fundamentally, it didn't solve the problem of quality, talent development, and culture, because there would be no guarantee that on the days people were required to come on site, any of the activities that would affect those outcomes would be prioritized or planned. And it didn't even guarantee that any of those things would continue when they were not on site. And it didn't deal with the fact that many valued employees did not live close enough to an office to have a regular commute that did not have a purpose behind it. And they had a subsidiary in another country, in another time zone, where people had to coordinate and plan with them, and they'd never be in the same place. So it was great I had her support, but I still needed to figure out a way to change the mindset of those leaders in that room, or my moment to get their support and buy-in would pass. So I decided to ask them a question. Raise your hand. Do you want people back in the office more? Or do you want them to be more intentional about planning in-person interactions? Raise your hand. And with that, 20 sets of hands went up to the second option. They wanted people to be more intentional about planning in-person interactions, whether it was in the office or at the client site or whatever. They just wanted it to be purposeful and toward these performance objectives they felt needed attention. So in the end, it wasn't even about the office. So I knew in that moment the mindset shift had happened with those 20 hands going up, so I decided to launch into my presentation of the high performance flexibility team activation process that these leaders would initiate. And the way they would initiate it is they would identify the activities that they felt required additional conversation and planning around how, when, and where they were happening. And by initiating and giving them their people the list of these activities, this then became what the teams would then activate and plan against. They had the agency within their teams to decide how, when, and where those activities would happen based on their clients, based on their geography, based on their workforce composition. And the teams would have a period from October until this recent May. And at that time, we'd step back, we'd see what are the best practices that are emerging, and we would begin to say, okay, what are some ongoing challenges that we have to continue to address? So in May, we started to take a look, and we found that indeed, the activities and outcomes that affect quality, development, and culture were happening. And the leaders were really pleased. But what was even more interesting is how they were happening. Is the teams had the agency and the structure to think through how and where these activities were going to happen best for them, and guess what? They chose to be together 2 to 3 days a week on average. Same number of days that would have been required had it been mandated. But the difference is they chose. And there was a rationale behind why they were together. And those 2 to 3 days tended to happen on a cadence that was not consistent across teams. Some days it was, certain days it was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday for some teams. Some teams it was other days. And for some it was 1 day, 1 week, another day it was 5 days because they had something to do with a client. But the point was it was flexible and it was intentional and it was based upon the outcomes that these teams were trying to achieve. And they were being very intentional not only about what they were doing together in person, but they were also intentional about what they were doing when they're not together. Because you cannot have a de facto 3-day-a-week work week, which is what happens when you just keep focusing on one thing that's happened when you're in the office. And they also really were thoughtful about how they were going to integrate their colleagues who couldn't be on site together as much as maybe everybody else could. And they also were much more effective about coordinating and planning with their colleagues in the subsidiary in the other country and the other time zone. Another interesting thing they discovered is that they actually used their office more. We don't hear that in the broader culture. We hear, oh, reduce workspace, but they ended up using their offices more because their clients were getting rid of office space and were also working flexibly. So some of the work that they used to do with the client, now they had to do on site. So what was rewarding about this, and as one of the leaders said, I gotta be honest with you, Cali, I kind of thought this wasn't gonna work, but it did. I'm kind of surprised, this is great. And what was rewarding for me is that I had a chance to see an organization, another organization, unlock the spark of performance, engagement, and well-being by coming together and intentionally thinking through how, when, and where the work is gonna be done best. And this is a vision of possibility I originally saw 30 years ago when I was a junior manager in training at a New York City bank. Now, I had no preconceived notions about how work should be done. I was in my 20s. But our business was lending to closely held companies. And there were no audited financial statements against which to make loans. So the relationship between the banker and the customer was really important. So when a banker would leave, usually because they didn't have flexibility, my business was vulnerable. So it made total sense to me that we should just let these people work from home a couple days a week or reduce their schedule. And I knew that I would then have an engaged, committed banker who would not have to leave, but could stay. Let's just say my leadership 30 years ago did not see the vision, but I did. So I left, I got an MBA, and I became a work flexibility strategist in 1995. And over those years, pre-COVID and since, I have worked with many visionary leaders who have seen the flexible future of work is now and have chosen to align the way work happens with that new reality. And in every instance, they have been rewarded with the spark. Now, here's what I've learned works. First, leaders and employees have to come into the process with a willingness to open up and shift their mindset. And what that means for a leader is that you have to be willing to challenge your default context that work and performance happen on site in an office. You have to be willing to see that performance and work can happen across workplaces, spaces, and time, and that it is flexible. And how you test that is you ask yourself to pick a business priority like talent and say, okay, so if I think about attracting and retaining talent, are they working across these different dimensions? If the answer is no, then you know when you come into this process, you really have to be open-minded to think about this differently. Now, for employees, they also have to be open to shifting their mindset. And right now what that means is you have to understand that the flexibility that you value right now was very likely executed under crisis circumstances. There was no time to thoughtfully plan how to do this really well. So there is a likelihood that it could be improved. And often it needs to be improved in terms of how we are coordinating with each other, everybody else who's working flexibly. So be open to how, when, and where do we work best, as well as how, when, and where do I work best. And finally, have a mindset your goal is work-life fit and not balance. By being able to fit your work and life together, you are going to be able to achieve what is possible versus balance, which tends to be the thing we never achieve. And with that open mind, you begin the process of reimagining work. And you want to start with the what and not the where. The reason we are struggling so much right now to figure out how we work going forward is we keep talking about the where, the number of days in the office. That doesn't get us anywhere. You have to start with what do we need to do, begin with the end in mind. And for those leaders in that conference room, the end was to improve quality, to develop our talent, and to maintain our culture. And so with that as the guide, then your teams can begin to think through where, when, and how they will achieve those objectives. Now, you want to answer the questions about the where. What are the locations and spaces that enable our work? When will we be together in person and when won't we? The when, what are the hours, the schedules, the norms around accessibility and responsiveness and meeting planning that will let us be successful? And the how do our tools help us communicate and coordinate effectively? And increasingly, what aspects of our job could be taken over by AI? And once you've answered those questions, you do begin to reimagine where, when, and how work will happen together. We have a historic opportunity in this moment to redefine a new, flexible work reality that not only benefits organizations, but also the people who work for them. The question is, will we take it? Thank you.